At noon on August 15, 1945, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki sat quietly inside the 5th Air Fleet headquarters in Kyushu. From a small radio speaker, Emperor Hirohito's voice announced what every Japanese officer had feared: the war was over. Japan had surrendered. Ugaki opened his diary, the Sensoroku, a journal he had kept since 1941, filling 731 pages with operations, strategies, and the private thoughts of a man witnessing the Pacific War from its highest command tiers. Now he prepared to write his final entry. He wrote that no official ceasefire order had reached him yet. He wrote that he alone bore responsibility for the failure to halt the American advance. And he wrote that he intended to fly one last mission himself, to prove the spirit of Bushido still lived within him. But what Ugaki didn't write in that final entry was the realization that had been growing inside him for years, ever since Midway. A recognition that Japan could never win this war. Not because its sailors lacked courage or its admirals lacked skill, but because American industry had made defeat mathematically unavoidable. The truth first hit him on June 8, 1942, 3 days after Midway. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, gone in one afternoon. Over 3,000 crew and dozens of elite aviators lost forever. At that time Ugaki wrote, "Let this terrible day never come again. Let it remain the greatest failure of my life." He still believed then that the setback could be overcome, until the intelligence reports began to arrive. Reports claiming American shipyards were producing escort carriers every 3 weeks. That new fleet carriers were being laid down simultaneously on both coasts. That destroyers, cruisers, submarines, everything, were being built in numbers that sounded unreal. But the numbers were real. 2 years later, in 1944, Ugaki witnessed the same nightmare repeat itself during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan's newest carrier, Taiho, was considered state-of-the-art, armored deck, modern damage control, a symbol of Japan's last naval hopes. A single American torpedo struck her. Hours later, a catastrophic explosion ripped through the ship, sending her to the bottom. That same day the carrier Shokaku was sunk as well. Later, Hyo and Chitose followed. Japan had entered the battle with 9 carriers. They left with 6. America entered with 15, and lost none. Intelligence briefings only confirmed what Ugaki already knew. While Japan built 6 aircraft carriers in the 3 years after Midway, the United States built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers alone, plus 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers, built with such speed that some were completed in just 3 months. By 1944, captured documents revealed that American shipyards had launched more naval tonnage in 2 years than Japan had managed in 2 decades. Liberty ships were being produced every 42 days. Destroyers that would take Japan 2 years were rolling out of American docks in 10 months. The Americans were building ships faster than Japan could sink them. Then came October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Ugaki stood aboard the battleship Yamato as her sister ship, Musashi, was hit again and again by waves of American aircraft. 19 torpedoes. 17 bombs. Even the world's largest battleship couldn't survive that punishment. Musashi rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. Ugaki understood the meaning instantly. If Musashi could die like this, Yamato could die like this. Any ship could. And with each battle, the American fleet only seemed larger. Japanese air cover during the final months of the war was almost non-existent. Most carrier-trained aviators had been wiped out during the Philippine Sea disaster 4 months earlier. And when the Battle of Leyte Gulf finally ended, Japan's navy was effectively gone. 4 more carriers sunk, 3 battleships lost, 10 cruisers and 11 destroyers destroyed. It was the largest naval engagement in human history, and it shattered Japan's ability to fight at sea. The American losses were minor by comparison: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a single destroyer escort. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy existed mostly in name. No carriers, almost no veteran pilots, and a crippling fuel shortage left most surviving ships stranded in home waters, unable even to move. But the Americans kept coming. More carriers. More battleships. More aircraft. Their navy had grown so vast that whole task forces could bombard Japanese cities at will. Battleships steamed close to shore, pounding factories and coastal defenses, and Japan could do nothing to stop them. In February 1945, Ugaki was placed in command of the 5th Air Fleet in Kyushu. His fleet consisted mainly of land-based planes, many of them assigned to kamikaze missions. Kamikaze attacks had become Japan's primary weapon not because they were decisive, but because they were the only option left. Young, barely trained pilots climbed into bomb-laden aircraft and flew toward American ships with no intention of returning. Ugaki organized the Kikusui operations, massive waves of kamikaze sorties aimed at the U.S. fleet around Okinawa. The attacks inflicted casualties and damaged numerous ships, but they failed to slow the American advance. Through April and May 1945, hundreds of kamikaze crashed against the U.S. Armada. None sank a single American capital ship. Cruisers, battleships, and fleet carriers continued fighting. The U.S. Navy was simply too large. Each successful attack barely scratched its strength. Ugaki recorded in his diary the shrinking number of usable planes, the declining skill of pilots, and the increasing mechanical failures caused by fuel shortages and a lack of spare parts. Japan was running out of aircraft, out of trained crews, out of fuel, out of everything except the willingness to die. On April 7, 1945, the Yamato sailed on her final mission. She carried enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa, where she was to be beached and used as a stationary gun platform. She never made it. American submarines detected her departure, and carrier groups launched hundreds of aircraft. Yamato was hit by at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs before a massive explosion tore her apart at 14:23. More than 3,000 men died. Ugaki had served aboard Yamato for months and personally knew many of the officers who went down with her. The ship meant to symbolize Japan's invincibility had been destroyed in less than 2 hours. By July 1945, Ugaki's diary grew darker. He wrote about cities burned to ash, industry in ruins, civilians starving, and defenses collapsing. He wrote about Hiroshima's destruction on August 6 and Nagasaki's annihilation 3 days later. Entire cities wiped out by a single bomb. When the Soviet Union declared war on August 8 and stormed into Manchuria, Japanese resistance there dissolved almost immediately. Ugaki understood what many in Tokyo still refused to admit: the war had been lost long ago. Perhaps even the day Japan attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity. On the morning of August 15, 1945, after hearing the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Ugaki made his final choice. He would not surrender. He would fly one last kamikaze mission toward the American fleet off Okinawa. He would die as a warrior and set an example, even if Vice no one Admiral else Matome Ugaki sat quietly inside him to reconsider. Headquarters in Vice Admiral From a small radio speaker, argued with him Emperor for an hour, Hirohito's insisting the war was over every and Japanese officer were meaningless. The war was over. Refused. Japan before boarding his aircraft, Ugaki opened his diaries, removing his rank insignia, a journal he has kept since 1941. He carried only a ceremonial short pages with operations gifted to him by Admiral Yamamoto and the private thoughts Yamamoto's witnessing the Pacific War from its highest command Ugaki tiers. Climbed into the rear seat of a Yokosuka D-4Y four-dive bomber. He wrote that no official ceasefire order had reached Tatsuo Nakatsu. He wrote that he alone bore responsibility for the failure to halt the American advance. Into the same and he wrote that he intended to fly one last mission rose into the sky with them, to prove the spirit what would become the final kamikaze mission of World War II. Didn't write in that final entry was the realization that had been growing inside him for years. The Admiral reported they had begun their recognition that toward an American ship never win but this U.S. war. Records show not no because its sailors lacked courage or its admirals almost certain skill, the planes were but shot because down American or industry had made defeat mathematically unavoidable. Back due the truth first hit him on June 8, they were the only survivors. 3 days after Midway was never found. 4 fleet carriers. His final diary entry ended Kaga, abruptly. Sorry, no summary, and Hiryu, no farewell. Gone in one only afternoon. The decision to die. Over 3,000 Japanese and dozens of uncovered aviators the war lost forever. Even those familiar with Ugaki wrote, Let this
American
terrible
industrial
day never come
output
again.
had been beyond
Let
anything
it remain
Japan
the
could have
greatest
imagined.
failure of
From
my
1941
life. He
to
still believed then
1945
that the setback
the United
could be
States
overcome
built nearly
until the
9,000
intelligence
war
reports
vessels.
began to
Japan
arrive.
built
Reports
about
claiming
670.
American shipyards were producing
America
escort
produced
carriers every 3 weeks.
aircraft
That
carriers
new fleet
of all
carriers
types.
were being laid down
Japan
simultaneously
built 25
on both coasts.
U.S. shipyards
that
launched
destroyers,
Liberty ships
cruisers,
at a rate of roughly 3
submarines,
every 2
everything,
days,
completing
built in
2,710
total,
unreal,
each
but the
capable of
numbers
carrying
were
10,000
real.
tons of cargo.
2 years later,
more than the
in
entire Japanese
1944,
merchant fleet
Ugaki
combined.
witnessed the same
American
nightmare
factories
repeat
produced
itself during the Battle of the Philippine Sea.
297,000 aircraft
Japan's
during the war.
newest carrier,
Japan
Taiho,
produced
was considered
76,000.
state-of-the-art.
By
Armored
1944,
deck, modern
U.S.
damage control,
industry was
a symbol of
outproducing
Japan's
Germany,
last naval
Japan,
hopes,
and
a
Italy
single
together.
American
In that
torpedo
single year,
struck her.
1944,
Hours later,
American
catastrophic
shipyards launched
explosion
more
ripped
tonnage
through the
than
ship,
Japan launched
sending
from
her to the bottom.
1939 to
That same day,
1945
the carrier
combined.
Shokaku
1
was
year
sunk as
of
well.
U.S. output
Later,
exceeded 6
Hyo
years
and
of Japan's.
Chitose followed.
The Essex-class
Japan
carriers
had
that had
entered the
flooded
battle
the Pacific
with 9
were
carriers.
originally expected
They
to take
left
36
36
months to build.
America
Wartime
entered with
improvements
15
cut that to
and
18
lost
to
none.
20 months.
Intelligence
One was
briefings
completed
only
in just
confirmed
14.
what Ugaki
17
already knew.
Essex carriers
While Japan
were
built
finished
6
by war's
aircraft
end.
carriers in the 3
years
14
after
saw
Midway,
combat,
the United
and
States
all
built
17
17
survived.
Essex-class fleet
Aircraft
carriers
production
alone,
was
plus 50
equally
Casablanca-class escort
B-17s
carriers built
that took
with such
Boeing
speed
200
that some were
days were
completed
built by
in just 3
Douglas
months.
and Lockheed in
By
half the time.
1944,
B-24s
captured documents
rolled out of
revealed
the
that
Willow Run
American
plant
shipyards
at a
had
rate
launched
of 1
more
bomber
naval tonnage
every
in
63
2 years
minutes
than Japan had managed in 2
F-6F
decades.
Hellcat production time
Liberty
dropped
ships
from
were
90
being
days
produced
to
every
65
42
through assembly
days.
line refinements.
Destroyers that
and
would
it wasn't
take
only
Japan 2
aircraft,
years were rolling out
artillery,
of American
tanks,
docks
trucks,
in 10 months.
Ammunition.
The
Everything
Americans
was
were
produced in
building
quantities
ships
that
faster than
eliminated
Japan
shortages
could sink them.
entirely.
Then came
Japan's
October
experience
24th was 1944.
Every
The Battle
loss
of
was
Leyte
permanent.
Gulf.
Ugaki
Damaged
stood
ships
aboard the
remained
battleship
in docks
Yamato
for
as
months.
her sister ship,
Destroyed
Musashi,
aircraft
was hit again
were
and again by
irreplaceable.
waves of
Spare
American
parts
aircraft.
were nearly
19
non-existent.
torpedoes.
Fuel was critically
17
low.
bombs.
By
Even the
1945,
world's largest
American
battleship
firebombing
couldn't
had
survive
obliterated
that
the last
punishment.
functioning factories,
Musashi rolled
including
over
the devastating
and
March
disappeared
9th
beneath
to 10th
the
raid
waves.
on Tokyo that
Ugaki
killed more than
understood the meaning
100,000
instantly.
people and
If
destroyed
Musashi
16
could die
square
like
miles
this,
of the city.
Yamato could
Japan
die like
had
this.
no remaining
Any ship
industrial
could.
base,
And with each
no
battle,
ships to
the
bring
American
resources,
fleet
only seemed
no
larger.
resources to feed
Japanese
its
air
factories.
cover during the final months of the
entire
war
was
effort
almost
had collapsed.
non-existent.
And Ugaki's
Most
diary,
carrier-trained
page after
aviators had been
page,
wiped out
captured
during
his
the
painful
Philippine Sea
realization
disaster
of this
4
final
months
truth.
earlier.
Early
And
in
when
the
the Battle
war,
of Leyte
Ugaki
Gulf
still
finally
believed
ended,
Japan's
Japan's
had a real
navy
chance.
was effectively gone.
After Midway,
For more carriers
that
sunk,
confidence
3
began to
battleships
crack.
lost.
By
10 cruisers and
1943,
11
he was
destroyers
openly
destroyed.
pessimistic.
It
And
was
by
the largest naval
1944,
engagement in
accepted
human history,
quietly,
and
grimly,
it shattered
that
Japan's
defeat
ability
was
to fight at sea.
One diary
The American
entry from
losses
October
were minor by
1944,
comparison.
written
One
shortly
light
after the
carrier,
Battle of
2
Leyte
escort
Gulf,
carriers,
records
2
that American
destroyers,
ship movement
and a single
suggested
destroyer
at least
escort.
30 carriers
After Leyte
operating
Gulf,
in the Pacific.
the Imperial
Ugaki
Navy
noted
existed
bitterly
mostly
that
in
Japan
name.
no longer had
No
a single
carriers,
carrier
almost
capable
no
of
veteran
offensive
pilots.
action, and a
The
crippling fuel
imbalance was
shortage
so
left
enormous
most
that
surviving
even
ships
attempting
stranded in
battle
home
amounted
waters,
to suicide.
unable even to move.
In another entry from
But
March
the Americans
1945,
kept coming.
he described
More
watching American
carriers,
battleships
more
bombard Kyushu
battleships,
from offshore,
more
firing
aircraft.
at Japanese coastal
Their navy
positions,
had grown
then
so
departing
vast
without
that whole
suffering a
task
scratch.
forces could
What
bombard
had
Japanese
once
cities
seemed
at will.
unimaginable was now
Battleships
routine.
steamed close to shore,
Japan could
pounding
not stop
factories
them.
and coastal
Japan
defenses,
could
and
barely
Japan
respond.
could do nothing to
By
stop
April
them.
1945,
In February
with the invasion of
1945,
Okinawa
Ugaki
underway,
was placed in
Ugaki
command
wrote
of the
that
5th
the Americans
Air
had
Fleet
arrived
in
with
Kyushu.
overwhelming
His
force,
fleet
consisted
760
mainly of
ships supporting
land-based
landings,
many
many
of
of
them
them
assigned
500
to
kamikaze providing a
missions.
constant umbrella
Kamikaze
of
attacks
air
had
cover.
become Japan's
Against
primary
this armada,
weapon, not
Japan
because
could
they were
offer
decisive,
only desperate
but because they were the only option left.
courageous,
But
young,
strategically
barely trained
useless.
pilots climbed
His
into
last
bomb-laden
entries before
aircraft
August
and
15th
flew toward
focused
American
on the
ships
atomic
with no
bombings
intention
and the
of
Soviet
returning.
invasion of
Ugaki
Manchuria.
organized the
Ugaki
Kikusui
acknowledged that
operations,
Japan had no
massive
means of
waves of
stopping
kamikaze
atomic weapons,
sorties aimed
no
at the
reserves
U.S.
to
fleet
counter Soviet
around
armor,
Okinawa,
and no
the
hope of
attacks
matching
inflicted
American
casualties
production.
and damaged
He even
numerous
feared
ships,
that the United
but they
States
failed to
possessed
slow
more
the
atomic
American
bombs
advance.
ready for use.
Through April
He
and May
was 1945. A third
Hundreds
bomb
of
was prepared for
kamikaze
use
crashed
in late
against the
August
US
had
Armada.
Japan continued
None
the fight.
sank a single
The tragedy of Ugaki's diary is that nearly everything he feared turned out to be true. American industrial capacity, the U.S. Navy was Japan's war effort long before the first shot was fired. Barely scratched Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Ugaki recorded in his diary the shrinking number of usable planes earlier. The declining skill of pilots studied and the increasing mechanical failures caused by fuel shortages and a lack of spare parts. Abundance of steel. Japan was running out of aircraft and manpower. Trained crews. He opposed war with America, even receiving death threats from extremists on April 7th, and when his warnings were ignored, the Yamato famously told his final mission, "I can run wild." She carried enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa, where she was to be beached and used as a stationary gun platform. He was frighteningly never made it. American submarines detected her departure, and carrier groups launched hundreds of aircraft. Yamato was hit by at least 11 torpedoes 6 months later. Bombs before a massive explosion. Japan never won another major naval battle. More than post-war thousands would later confirm the grim mathematics served aboard Yamato for months, and personally knew many of the officers who went down. Once American industry had fully mobilized, Japan's invincibility had been mathematically in less than 2 hours. Even if Japan had won every battle after Midway, Ugaki's diary grew darker. The United States would still have won the war by simple attrition. Industry in ruins. American civilians were building vessels and defenses than Japan could sink them. He wrote about Hiroshima's destruction on August 6th, and Nagasaki's annihilation 3 days later. 1944, entire cities wiped out were slowing production not due to Soviet Union declared because war they already had more ships than the Pacific Fleet could employ. Japanese additional Essex-class carriers were delayed or cancelled purely because they were unnecessary. Still refused to admit. Meanwhile, the war had no such luxury. Perhaps even the day Japan attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity claimed the Pacific on the morning of August 15th, Midway, or Guadalcanal, or in the waters of the Emperor's broadcast. But economists made his industrial historians reached a clearer conclusion. The war was effectively decided before it began. Toward the American fleet off Okinawa, Japan produced about 7 million tons of steel a year. The United States produced more than 80 million. Japan relied almost entirely on imported oil. The United States produced over 1 billion barrels. Even Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, his officers could place carriers in fleet headquarters, while Japan might never from a small radio argued with him for Hirohito, insisting the war was over. Every Japanese officer knew the outcome. The war Ugaki refused. Japan before boarding his aircraft. Ugaki opened his diary. Many Japanese naval rank and sigma understood dark by 1943. He carried only 7 short pages with to accept reality by Admiral Yamamoto. Private thought Soviet intervention in the Pacific War highest command. Ugaki climbed into the rear Allied forces recovered Ugaki's diary from his quarters. He wrote that Allied officials. It was eventually translated and published in 1991. He wrote that he evading Okoshi and edited by Donald Ugaki, the American villain, into the same. For the first time, he intended to rely on other aircraft rose in the sky with the high-level strategic final kamikaze surrender. But what Ugaki didn't document in 1924 hours, the realization transmitted and the steady decline of Japan's naval power. They had begun to recognize that American shipbuilding never win at U.S. production not because its sailors worries about pilots. It is almost certain planes, but because American industry had made it. He never abandoned unavoidable duty. The truth even after accepting that the war was unwinnable. He continued sending Ugaki's pilots was never found. His final diary entry and his final act no summer hearing, no farewell in one afternoon. Decision to die over 3,000 Japanese and dozens of the war. Even those familiar with Ugaki wrote, he carries with terrible sword never come again beyond anything Japan could have never returned. From 1941, he still believed that the United States overcome nearly, but until the intelligence reports began to Japan built reports claiming American ships remains were producing escort the diary every 30 weeks. All handwritten pages carriers were being laid down simultaneously. 25 researchers can U.S. shipyards launched Liberty cruiser rate of roughly trace every 2 days. Optimism were being built and war ground total real. Some incapable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. 2 years later, more than the entire Japanese merchant fleet. Others are haunting American factories, analyzing strategy. 97,000 aircraft during newest carrier. Japan produced the final state-of-the-art by 1944. Modern U.S. industry was a symbol of Japan. Last the naval host broadcast a single American torpedo. In that single year, 19 hours later, a catastrophic explosion more tonnage than Japan launched to carry out one last attack. That same day, Japan's carrier Shokaku remained 1 year of
well.
U.S. output
Then later
exceeded 6 years of Japan's
farewell.
The Essex-class carriers that had flooded the Pacific were originally expected to be airfield with 6 months to build. America wartime improvements cut that to an 18. This is how wars intelligence was complete. Not only negotiations what Ugaki already knew. Commanders while Japan built 6 aircraft carriers yet conformed to fight combat. The United States built 17 Essex-class to uncover production battles plus 50 Casablanca-class escort B-17 built with such 200 days were built by Douglas and Lockheed in by 1944. B-24 documents rolled out of the Willow American shipyards had launched more naval tonnage every 63 years than Japan had managed in 2 decades. Hellcat production time Liberty dropped from 90 days to 65 through assembly line refinement. Destroyers that would take Japan aircraft, 2 years were rolling out of American docks trucks, in 10 months. Ammunition. The Americans was produced in quantities that eliminated shortages entirely. Then came October 24th was 1944. Every loss was permanent. Ugaki stood aboard the battleship Yamato as her sister ship Musashi aircraft was hit again and again by waves of American aircraft. Were nearly non-existent torpedoes. Fuel was critically low. Bombs. By 1945, American firebombing had obliterated the last functioning factories, Musashi rolled including over the devastating March 9th beneath the waves on Tokyo that killed more than 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Yamato could die like had no remaining industrial base, and with each battle to bring American fleets only seemed no resources to feed Japanese air cover during the final months of the war was almost non-existent. And Ugaki's carrier-trained aviators had been wiped out captured during the painful realization of this final truth earlier. Early in the Battle of Leyte Gulf finally ended, Japan's navy was effectively gone. After Midway, for more carriers confidence 3 battleships lost. By 1943, he was openly pessimistic. It was the largest naval engagement in human history, quietly and it shattered Japan's ability to fight at sea. One diary the American losses were minor by comparison. Written shortly after the Battle of Leyte Gulf carriers records that American ship movement and a single destroyer at least 30 carriers after Leyte Gulf in the Pacific. The Imperial Navy noted bitterly that Japan no longer had a single carrier almost no offensive action, and a crippling fuel shortage so enormous surviving even attempting battle in home amounted to suicide, unable even to move. In another entry from March 1945, he described watching American battleships bombard Kyushu from offshore, more firing at Japanese coastal positions. Their navy had grown so departing without suffering forces could bombard Japanese cities unimaginable was battleships steamed close to shore, Japan could pounding factories and coastal defenses could barely respond. Could do nothing to stop them. By April 1945, in February 1945, with the invasion of Okinawa Ugaki was placed in command wrote that the Americans had arrived with overwhelming force. His fleet consisted mainly of ships supporting the landings. 1,500 kamikaze providing a constant umbrella kamikaze attacks had become Japan's primary weapon, not Japan because they were decisive, desperate, but because they were the only option. Courageous, young, strategically trained pilots climbed into bomb entries before August 15th and flew toward American ships with no intention of Soviet invasion of Manchuria. organized the Kikisui operation. Japan had massive waves of kamikaze sorties aimed at the U.S. to counter Soviet Okinawa, and no hope of matching American casualties and damaged he even numerous feared ships, that the United States possessed more atomic bombs ready for use. Through April and May 1945, a third bomb was prepared for use in late August had Japan continued to fight. Sank a single tragedy of Ugaki's diary is that nearly everything he feared turned out to be true. American industrial capacity the U.S. Navy was Japan's too large effort long before the first shot was fired. Barely scratched Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto Ugaki recorded in his diary the shrinking number of usable planes earlier, the declining skill of pilots studied and the increasing mechanical failures caused by industrial heartlands and a lack of spare parts. Abundance of steel, Japan was running out of aircraft and man-trained crews. He opposed war with America, even receiving death threats from extremists. On April 7th, and when his warnings were ignored, the Yamato famously told his staff, final mission. I can run wild. She carried enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa, where she was to be beached and used as a stationary gun platform. He was frightened. She never made it. American submarines detected her departure, and carrier groups launched hundreds of aircraft. Yamato was hit by at least 11 torpedoes 6 months later. Bombs before a massive explosion Japan never won another major naval battle. More than post-war analysts would later confirm the grim Ugaki had served aboard Yamamoto for months, and personally knew many of the officers who went down with her. Once American industry had fully symbolized Japan's invincibility had been mathematically in less than 2 hours. Even if Japan by July 1945 after Midway Midway with
Ugaki's
equal
diary
losses,
grew darker.
the United States
He wrote
would
about
still have
cities
won the
burned
war
to
by
ash,
simple attrition,
industry in ruins,
American civilians were
starving,
building vessels
and defenses
faster than
collapsing.
Japan could sink
He
them.
wrote about Hiroshima's
Faster, in
destruction
fact,
on
than
August
Japan
6
could even
and
Nagasaki's
Nagasaki's
annihilation 3
By late
days later.
1944,
Entire cities
U.S. shipyards
wiped out
were
by a
slowing
single
production
bomb.
not due
When
to
the Soviet
shortages,
Union
but
declared
because
war
they already
on
had
August
more
8th
ships than
and
the
stormed
Pacific
into
Fleet could
Manchuria,
employ.
Japanese
Additional
resistance there
Essex-class
dissolved almost
carriers were
immediately.
delayed or canceled
Ugaki
purely
understood
because
what
they were
many in Tokyo
unnecessary.
still refused
Japan,
to admit.
meanwhile,
The war had been lost
no
long
such
ago.
luxury. Perhaps
It could
even the
only
day
fight
Japan
with
attacked
what it
a nation
already
with
possessed.
10 times its
Some
industrial
historians
capacity.
claim the Pacific
On the
War
morning
was
of
decided
August
at
15,
Midway,
1945,
or
after
in the
hearing
waters
the
of the
Emperor's
Philippine
surrender
Sea.
broadcast,
But
Ugaki
economists
made his
and
final
industrial
choice.
historians
He
reached a
would
clearer
not
conclusion.
surrender.
The
He
war
would
was
fly
effectively
one last
decided before
kamikaze
it began.
mission toward the
In
American fleet
1941,
off Okinawa. Japan produced about 7 million tons of steel a year. The United States produced more than 80 million. Japan relied almost entirely on imported oil.